Hello, welcome back to the last artist talk today. With us is Marko Peljhan, and we will talk about his early projects and try to somehow address them in this context of fictioning and world building and the questions of the future. The projects were done in the 90s, early 90s, and in the context of Slovenia, these approaches maybe were not that common. So I hope we can unpack that a bit. But first, I'll present Marko. So Marko Peljhan is a theater and radio director, conceptual artist, and researcher. He founded and co-founded several still active arts organizations in the 90s, such as 𝗍𝗏𝗀𝗀 and one of the first media labs in Eastern Europe, Ljubljana. From 1994 onwards, he worked on MacroLab, a project that focuses on telecommunications, migrations, and weather systems research in an intersection of art, science, and engineering. He also did the project, the Interpolar Transnational Art and Science Constellation and the Arctic Perspective Initiative. He received many prizes for his work, including the 2001 Golden Nika Prize at Ars Electronica, and showed his work in many festivals, also in Documenta. He serves as a professor and director of the MIT Systemics Lab at the University of California, Santa Barbara, the chair of the Media Arts and Technology program at UCSB, the coordinator of international cooperation of the 𝗧𝗵𝗲, Slovenian Center for Space Sciences and Technologies, and editor at large of the music label 𝗟R𝗱𝗃. In the radio spectrum, he is known as 𝗧𝗵𝗲. I asked Marko to, maybe for the introduction, read the first text, which was written for the concept of MacroLab in 1994, I think, or 3 even. So we'll start with that, with this reading, and then dive into the topic.
Thank you very much, Tjaša, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and to be at least today participating in the Biennale. And yes, actually this is the first time anybody asked me to read this text, so that's interesting for me. I didn't prepare the reading, so I'm gonna read it from my phone. Hopefully it's gonna go okay. The title is Krka. Krka is an island in the Adriatic Sea, the largest, but there's a dispute now which one is the largest, or Krka or 𝗍𝗵𝗲, because with the satellite pictures they figured out that they're so close. There's a dispute at the moment. Here it goes. It was a sunny late winter day of 1994. The location, the island of Krka, Adriatic Sea, Croatia. The 𝗍𝗫, moon landscape above Baška. It is us, the inventors, explorers of the new sensibilities, children of number 317, walking high up above the sea, glistening in the sun and deeper blue than ever. The bay is far below. To the south, Goli otok, the barren landscape of this island, with its recent horrific past of a high-security prison and a genuine Yugoslav gulag in the 50s and early 60s. Memories of the stories we have read about extensively during the evolutionary 80s, growing up. Deconstructing states, projecting visions. To the east, the 𝗍𝗏𝗀𝗀 Mountains, a spectacular sight, monumental, barren, cold, silently majestic. Behind them, occupied Lika, and further east, 𝗍𝗵𝗀𝗶, war. Me, Ivana, and Ivan. This is a beautiful day. For the last week, we have been discovering the secrets of dead cities, the flavors of local herbs, the chai Zamir, tea for peace, discussing what comes next, if this war will rage on, if our friends will die, disappear, and whole city populations shift and cease to exist? What if this heavy winter silence doubles in weight during the summer and pulls everything down? What is next for us, the creators of the landscape of the future? We have been discussing what the theater of the future should look like, what it should be, how to start living outside the three axes of Euclid and start understanding the laws of the fourth, the axis of time, so much revered by Velimir Hlebnikov. The language sorcerer, the author of Ladomir, the discoverer of the laws of time, the inventor of the tables of destiny. Are we witness to the new battle of Tsushima, or are we just being thrown around by the constructed history with this all just a learning situation? For the future, as we sit high above the sea, we hear thunderous noise coming from the east, but the sky is blue. There is barely an audible rhythm, the maddening powers of at work, the towers of war, the battles of our lives. Not far away, death and destruction. High above, the lonely combat air patrol, two small contrails. Lower and to the north, one of the Zagreb-Brindisi relief flights, a turboprop, probably Spanish. Maybe I wish I had my VHF transceiver with me. What exactly is going on? The visible and the invisible merge into an extensive landscape. The past and the future converge. The machines of construction and destruction working in unison. There is no forest, but the fate is ever present in these stones. We start talking about survival. Survival of the constructive, inventive, exploring forces. Survival of performative systems during the deconstruction of society. I see stages move and walk by themselves, armored and autonomous. Ivana laughs. As always, this is Ivana Popović, a dear friend of mine, artist from Croatia who passed away 2 years ago. She constructs lightning second skins, stealing the sight of many with the lightness of 1,000 winds. But first I talk about the landscape of Ladomir, right here on the earth moon of Krka. People wrapped in survival cocoons, sleeping, other people visiting them. They are silently talking to each other. A stage appears on the horizon and walks slowly forth. On it, the sailors of Ladomir work the spinnaker of thought. Large sails propel it forward. A complex mechanism allows its legs to lift and twist. There are no metal noises. The materials are new and unknown. It does not have legs, and it looks like an insect. It has the functionality and energy balance of a bee and the armor of an Armageddon cockroach. I will discuss this with Yuri. I have to talk to him back home. What would the people do? Will be his first question. I'm quite sure about that. Survive and understand would be my first answer. By, for, and on themselves. Operate and keep the legged drifter working, functioning. They will connect themselves to the satellites. They will roam the globe. They will discover its deep laws. They will be creators from all directions, brought on the platform by different winds, scientists and artists, discovering the laws of time, of communication, of the electromagnetic flux, of the navigation of whales, birds, and people. They will measure and calculate the dynamics of thunder and cells. They will equate and understand the final equation and law. They will sail far away at incredible speeds, and the world will become their stage. There is a little silence then, and Ivana laughs, and we still hear the explosions, and real is more real than real. When we walk down, I start to think about the perfect plan, the map. I decide I will write the first text for this project of the future.
Thank you, Marko. And this project was Macro Lab, which actually then was enacted or started to exist in reality, but this was like the first concept that you wrote. And I find this text really interesting in many aspects. So first of all, describing this kind of these times, or like the situation, the setting, as a very contradictory. On one hand, you have this raging war. It was the war when Yugoslavia fell apart, and in midst of this uncertainty and about the future, somehow you described something like this text is something like a beginning of a novel, or even like a description of a dream, some dream or some vision of a future in the middle of this desolate landscape of this island, which is like rocky and doesn't have any vegetation, and like, war raging in the background that you can hear and so on. So this somehow kind of maybe sketches out some outlines of the 90s, the early 90s. And maybe we can start by talking a little bit about this context, especially how mainstream cultural context reacted to these contradictions. I mean, your reaction somehow is obvious from this text, but how did this kind of more of a visionary mindset, more of a future-oriented mindset, which maybe somehow also draws from more sci-fi scenarios. I mean, you're talking about fully automated stages that have some agency and like technology that somehow, becomes an agent and so on. How did these ideas work within the 90s context and the mindset that was then mainstream? And why did it feel for you like that, this is important to take this road to think about the future in the context when the history was ending and the future was cancelled?
Yeah, thank you. Well, the way I experienced the 90s is probably very different from the way a lot of, my contemporaries did. And it was also I would say for a large part of society was also a time of new type of isolation. I mean, if we talk about this local context in Slovenia, the kind of newly minted country, it started with this short war, first the independence movement and all of that. If we talk about the country, if we talk about national identity, it's a different story. But the defining moment for myself personally in the 90s was, of course, that there was this war very nearby, and which completely reshuffled everything we knew, because I grew up in the time where we believed that a war of the kind that then happened is not possible. Yeah, it was like, we were waiting for the big, Armageddon nuclear conflict between, the Soviet Union and the West. But what we got was something very, very different. And so that was the first thing, and I felt, extremely compelled to reflect upon this new state. And then, there were more personal connections, visceral, less visceral things connected to kind of also a lot of optimism that was, existing in those times in the cultural spheres in the West. So there was, which we were very connected to at the same time. And so there was a kind of suspension of belief between these two moments, right? Our reality was one of a proximity of war, and of course also, of our friends and acquaintances and people we knew that, died and so on, or, had to escape or were stuck in Sarajevo. And, or for that matter, even, in the beginning, in 1992, Zagreb, and early 93. So it was a very, very hard time because we were also very connected to this cultural space. So, and, but there was also kind of an oblivion on the other hand. Ljubljana and Slovenia wanted to kind of get away, to move away from this context. The war, did not have such a strong effect on us here. And there was a push towards, kind of an urban, westernized state of affairs, if you want, the mentality and so on. So it was a very particular moment in time. And I just felt that reflection of this, that something very fundamental is shifting, that this whole, Fukuyama, end of history story was completely ridiculous from our point of view, because the history really started yet again, right? It restarted in a kind of a very tumultuous way. And so, my main concern then, which is, to a certain degree even today, it was reflection of these systems. I believe that in the arts we have this privilege of kind of, probing events in society from unknown points of view, and that's what this whole work was in a way in the beginning. But I come from theater. Performance is always connected to this, right? It has a cathartic moment. It has, of course, a very therapeutic even elementality in it. So that's how I viewed art, and from the beginning. So I don't think I answered your question, but
yeah, sure. I'll ask some more. Mentioning this context, I mean, like the mainstream of, let's say, contemporary art in Slovenia at that time, I mean, especially knowing that Slovenia didn't really experience the war in a sense as like the other former Yugoslav countries did, and it was quite fast in terms of like, going into this, as you mentioned, like Western type of, contemporary art practices, which were like very much relational aesthetic, let's say, focused on more like some social interventions, quite micro-political. So the focus went from, let's say, the 20th century big ideas, utopian ideas, and like the 80s, more of a, political, critical, but like systemic critique of a system on a larger scale, to this very micro-political, present-oriented, like localist somehow interventions and projects. But like this text that you just read and like what you're explaining now, I mean, it's oriented towards the future, and it has this utopian somehow, let's say, feel to it still, which is something that at that time was supposedly, something that was not viable anymore. Utopias, there were like a failed project, the only thing that now exists, like there were no alternatives, of course, it was just neoliberalism and so on. And but I find it interesting that like the whole project, like even before Macro Lab existed as a title, maybe you can correct me if I'm mistaken, but actually the initial project was called Ladomir, so
Ladomir Factura.
Factura, yes. And it was, so the Macro Lab project was initialized somehow as a response to a poem that was written by Russian avant-garde futurist writer 𝗍𝗶𝗰𝗲, and the poem was titled Ladomir. This word, as I read from the internet, it designates the universal land of the future. Can you maybe just tell a little bit more about the role of futurist poet 𝗧𝗵𝗲 in your work and why this name was chosen and so on?
Okay, thanks for this. Yeah, well, you know, I have a very strong relationship with the historic avant-gardes in general, and you know, when I discovered 𝗧𝗵𝗲 with his whole opus in particular, and then I discovered, of course, Ladomir poem, which, you know, it's we have published a book. We translated it in Slovenian. It's out there. It's a very rare publication. I don't know if we have any copies left somewhere, but it's a poem that actually is a reflection of, you know, a world that, you know, Russian history is super dense in language and so on, but also a projection of a future. So Ladomir, actually, the word itself is constructed in Russian from Lad and Mir, Lada, which is both a ship, yeah, a sailboat, but also a swan, and also kind of designates harmony, yeah. And then Mir, which again is the world, the future, all of these things together. So the world in harmony, yeah. Just the opposite of 𝗬𝗏𝗀𝗏𝗏𝗏, which is world in disharmony, yeah. And I grew up with both, yeah. So I you know, in the 80s when 𝗬𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 came out, it was a very, very important film for me. And on the other hand, then of course, the whole historic avant-gardes were extremely formative, because I grew up in Nova Gorica, and there was this interesting connections that were just personal to people like August Černigoj, who we personally knew as kids, yeah, who would appear in some cultural events and so on. And then, of course, the understanding that a lot of the avant-garde artists like Srečko Kosovel and Marko Peljhan and even Ferdinand Delak, they were all kind of working in our region there on the border with Italy, which was natural, yeah, because of course, Italian futurism. So there's a whole moment there of kind of identification with the very, very local phenomena, yeah, for myself. And then, you know, at the same time, you had this renewed interest in historical avant-gardes, in the literary theory in Slovenia, the rediscovery of Kosovel, of Integrali, and the republishing of Integrali. At the same time, when we were in the beginning of high school. So all of kind of these things fell into place. And that, and then you had also, of course, Laibach and NSK, and the big kind of turbulent situation of societal change in general, yeah? So-called constitutional changes in Slovenia, which again, as young people, we were very engaged in. So we believed in, you know, it was a very lawful activity, yeah? The constitutional changes of the Yugoslav constitution, the amendments to the Yugoslav constitution, they were all, you know, these were long processes. This was not some revolution, it was not some war. It was a very, very long process where a lot of things fell into place. Freedom of speech, we had a verbal, a law against basically freedom of speech in Yugoslavia, the 133rd clause of the Kazenski zakonik. And so there was all of these, you know, things were happening, and you understood society as a very manageable, almost entity, yeah? And all of these processes seemed kind of transparent and possible. And there was a huge coalition at the time the coalition for change and freedom and so on. So, which was not against, of course, now this is completely misinterpreted against communism and so on. It was something very different. It was for something, not against something. It was for a completely new, for a redefinition of society and for the establishment of a free individual, yeah? And, in society, a responsible one, and something we deal with even today on a daily basis, really, even if you look at this whole, global pandemic situation. So the 80s were extremely important on that level, and the 90s were kind of a reckoning that, all of that energy actually resulted in something, but it did not provide for this land of the future. The utopia did not happen, yeah. What happened was kind of a reckoning, yeah, the utopias are living somewhere else, not in the desert of the real, yeah. You kind of got used to that, but the idea of kind of imagining these other structures never went away, at least for me, yeah. But it was again on multiple levels, from cultural policy and so on. I mean, a little bit of that because we talked about it already.
And but all of these other structures were not just imagined, but you were there then also constructed, engineered. I mean, your projects somehow, the vision of the stage that is somehow self-sufficient and looks like a cockroach, aluminum one or like metal one, and is placed in a desolate environment and so on. From the text that you read at the beginning, this is actually macro lab that was then built. Maybe, I mean, we're having a kind of like a slideshow of photos, but in between of them you'll see there's this photo with a sunset or sunrise, I'm not sure, but they're like with just like this empty landscape, and on it is this aluminum, kind of like silver capsule, which actually was built and did function as a platform for long years as for artistic research and as a residency. But maybe for people that don't know this project here in the public that are from other countries, maybe because here it's quite well known in Slovenia, maybe you can just briefly describe what Macro Lab is about, or what it was.
I think the text kind of describes the motivation behind it, but the idea was, of course, to materialize this structure, yeah, which had a lot of iterations, and once we started building it, of course, it changed, it evolved. Each time we set it up, it had more autonomy, it had more systems, and for me, it was very important that it's all that it's actually a functional, system, that it's not just a sculpture, yeah, or something like that. It was a machine for living, and it, programmatically, it was devoted to, Macro Lab was devoted to the research, and still is, because I kind of, for me, this project is not over yet, is devoted to the research of weather and climate, migrations. I always pointed out not only migrations of people and so on, but also animals, ideas, energy, economy, capital, yeah, and telecommunications, yeah. So the three dynamic systems that define the contemporary worlds. And so the dynamic movement of everything on the planet, then weather and climate as a very specific point, and look how much we are dealing with it in the last, 20 years, maybe 15, I don't know, depends how you count, how long you go back. Again, the climate, for me personally, the climate problem started, in the early 80s, late 70s, when we were reading about this in science kind of publications for kids, yeah. It was already talked about then, the greenhouse effect and so on. And so it was very, again, very formative, very important. And new sources of energy, so Makrolab was solar and wind powered. Again, in those years, it was really difficult to find even this technology and to put it all together. So, you know, the effort was quite major, but theater is always a big effort anyway. So we came kind of at it from, approach it as a complex, you know, theater project, like an opera. And then you could actually make it happen. But yeah, it traveled around the world. When I started Makrolab programmatically, when it was not built yet, and when it was invited to be materialized at Documenta 10 by Catherine David, which, you know, was very, again, important, because I don't think the project would have been materialized so quickly if it weren't for that invitation, because of course, you know, on the local level, everybody was looking like at me like I came from another planet, yeah, when I talked about this. And when I got that invitation, I literally went to a bank and asked for a loan with that piece of paper. And I got the loan, so I could actually build the lab. So, you know, it was, that's the way, you know, things happen. For me, the idea of materializing this, you know, projects also on the institutional level to make things real. If we talk about satellites, then to actually build one. If we talk about telecommunications, to really engage in that field was always crucial, because I even, you know, when I talk to my students, I always tell them that the crucial point of dealing with any medium, especially if you deal with these transitory ones and immaterial ones, is to really go deep into its logic and history, to understand what it means to work with a computer, you know. So yeah, and that's why I'm so happy that you named this Biennale ISKRA DELTA. I found that so pleasant when I learned about it.
But still, like, okay, you're talking now about the necessity to actually, you know, materialize these projects and like to be engaged in the fields on which they address and so on. But nevertheless, all of your projects always somehow retain this fictional aspect to it. So, for example, with Makrolab, but also with 𝗬𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀, which is like urban colonization and orientation gear, which was like proto-GPS, mobile GPS device that you've built before mobile phone actually existed. I mean, you will be able to see in the slideshow also certain patches that were done for these projects, and also there are photos, not in the slides, but like they exist, of you wearing some kind of uniform which crosses like military gear, or, you know, so it's always like some kind of using, playing with corporate and military rhetorics and aesthetics, and using of this official address, uniforms, patches, documents, and records of various sorts, be it fictional or real. But also, you've shown me, like just 2 weeks ago, your internal communication, like the faxes you were sending with your collaborators in this project, and you kind of use this official address, like as if some official government agency would be mailing somebody else. So even when this was not public, you kind of, you know, you were in the role somehow. So you were role playing. Actually, you were LARPing. You were live action role playing, like the whole project. I mean, today LARP is something like that. You know, it's like a word that goes around and everybody does it and so on. But in a way, you being kind of your background being in theater, it makes much sense. So that's something also like the organizational aspects that bring a project to life are also part of the play somehow, and are also role played and enacted, and in a way fiction in this sense becomes real, or becomes reality, starts to change reality, and also probably influenced how you actually did these projects. It would be different if you would totally separate the organizational part and then LARPed for the public, for example. So I mean, how does this, like, what is it with all the patches? Like you were wearing one now actually on your pants. I mean, how does this, why was this important? And how does it differ from the theater field, where you're not as active, you're more like in contemporary art field, in the development of technologies and so on?
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Well, you know, in terms of role playing, yeah, this is one of these cycles where history is constantly reinvented, yeah, and it's nothing new to use appropriation and tools of systems that you are all the time probing and trying to not counter, but to understand and kind of be in a constant dialectical state with, yeah. And I've gone at length in that direction. I think maybe too much sometimes, yeah, on all levels. Because a lot of the things that, you know, the projects that had to then happen really engaged with these worlds and still are. So this is also, as you know, part of my life. And I find that extremely sometimes tiring, but most of the time extremely rewarding, because I call this, you know, speaking of different languages, yeah, and it's amazing to embed yourself basically in situations where you can you know, really understand systems that you wouldn't have access to otherwise. And I think, you know, that's a very big privilege of art. And you know, because I always talked about the license of irresponsibility, but I never meant that in kind of a destructive sense, yeah? Like, 𝗟𝗻𝗲𝗀𝗃 hoću s vami strojit njet. This is, you know, I will break things with you, but not build, yeah? But more just the opposite, you know, strojit ja hoću s vami 𝗟𝗻𝗲𝗀𝗃 njet. And even though I was an avid reader of Bakunin and a lot of anarchistic texts, I certainly think that there is a role for, of course, also extremely tense, let's call them destructive forces in society, but I also believe much more in construction, yeah? So I'm very constructivist, oriented, productivist almost, yeah, for those who know that term historically. But in terms of just role playing and that, yeah, it was very funny when we found those faxes just 2 weeks ago by chance, yeah, in that box when we were searching for photos. And I forgot about that, of course. And, you know, we found this communication with my collaborators, and it was all basically as if institutions are talking to institutions, yeah. And you know, on one side it was just a joke. It was sometimes probably to make things less boring, you know. But on the other hand, if you look at it now, it really looks like a very interestingly conceived plan. And I think it was, you know, some of those things were not programmatic at all, yeah. It kind of stuck on you. We were not made out of Teflon, so you deal with the military-industrial complex, and then you kind of start thinking, start performing this thinking of that complex, yeah.
But nevertheless, this performing also enabled you some access to documents and blueprints of technologies from the West that you otherwise would not be able to receive for 𝗬𝗏, for the urban colonization and orientation gear. I remember you told me that you were writing to these companies in America, which were very interested to invest in Slovenian, economy, like the newly formed Slovenian state and so on. And you wrote to them as if you were a company, asking them to send over some, blueprints.
Yeah,
and
we founded a phantom organization called PACT Systems, Projekt Communication Technologies, and then there was my dear friend and colleague at the time, 𝗏𝗏𝗀𝗏𝗃, when we started communicating, he then, there was a band called Planetary Assault Systems, and he started using the Planetary Assault Systems moniker, and we would send faxes to each other with this kind of hoping that somebody would intercept that shit, you know. and discussing, you know, missile guidance systems and stuff like that, which, interestingly enough, you know, this was all pre-September 11th. It was a different world. Satellite communications were mostly analog, or if they were digital, they were not coded, so it was very easy to intercept SATCOM. You know, the Western military-industrial complex was looking for new markets. There was this feeling of, you know, end of history in terms of there's only one superpower, and they were very open, yeah? The idea of open society and so on. It was always interesting that, you know, for me it was interesting that, you know, some kid from Slovenia would send a letter to, you know, Buzz Allen Hamilton, you know, being interested in the satellite guidance system for bombers, and they would like, "Dear Mr. Peljhan," you know, they would write back, right? It was kind of beautiful. I mean, a lot of that communication, I think, is now part of a collection in Museum of Modern Art, but it was amazing, and that kind of culminated in my project that I did at PS1, MoMA, in New York, where MoMA itself then helped me, you know, collect, not only write to these people, but collect the specimens to be exhibited in the museum as part of the exhibition. It was curated by the now very infamous and then very young Klaus Biesenbach. At the time, 99, show was called Generation Z. He had no clue what I was doing. I mean, he said, "Marko, bring a big missile. I want a big missile in the stage." That's what, you know, that's how far he could go with understanding what this was all about. But then there were other people in the museum that got what needs to be done, and we got, you know, pieces from Israel, you name it. It was really interesting, and it was a show that could also never be repeated because all of that, most of that electronics and stuff was on loan. We had to return all, you know, most of the stuff back, and yeah. But that's how my whole unmanned systems story started, yeah. And the project was called Trust System 15, Tactical Radio Unified System Transport number 15. That was.
And also, this then somehow developed into actual company. But we won't go into that. But I mean, these translations between something being art or something being just imagined, envisioned like a fiction, and then materialized as a prototype, and then just actually gaining traction, you know, in the world.
Yeah, I never refused that moment. I still find it so interesting that actually then you create something in the context of art. It has all the elements of fictionality, but it's grounded in material reality. And then there is opportunities, yeah, to kind of, and you know, I found myself working in that field, and suddenly I am going to conferences and see, oh, there's 150 people here. This was Association of Unmanned Vehicles International, AUVSI. And I went to the first conference, and it was a fly on the wall, you know. It was the only time when I made the strangest thing where you know, it said business attire, you know, so I went to a men's warehouse in Washington, D.C. and bought myself a suit, you know. It was horrible. I felt so strange. I felt like an imposter because I was not in my classical kind of art uniform. And that I never repeated that mistake again. So now in any occasion, I'm just myself, yeah.
Just wearing the patches from your
Yes,
project.
sometimes. Today,
Okay.
yeah, I didn't even notice that I have it, but this is from the company.
Okay, so before I ask the public if they maybe have some questions, just one more from my side. Maybe on this notion or difference between, you know, art that reflects and critiques the present and somehow analyzes the current state of things, and a critique that is not a reflection but a process somehow. And I found, like, in one of your interviews you're describing, I will now kind of roughly translate because it was in Slovenian, and you say, you're talking about art and kind of its ways of mode of operation, and you're saying, if some artwork includes distance or reflection of a situation in which it kind of emerges or like it exists, this is already a step forward. But if this reflection is also implemented in obratno sorazmerno, what is the Slovenian word, English word for this? I don't know, like if this reflection is also implemented, then it somehow works, and it works on a specific cell in the structure of power, social society and spectacle. It also then is part of the transformative evolutionary process, and that the principle is very similar to the principle or structure of how viruses work on living organisms. Constant adaptation, recognition, attack, retreat, transformation, observation, adaptation, attack, retreat. And when I read this, I was immediately reminded, I mean, this sounds very much like, you know, cybernetic feedback loops. And this being an important reference for certain media and cultural theories in the 90s, were these theories important for you, or these ideas of cybernetic, and did this somehow influence also how you structured your works and projects?
They were, but not. I only started really studying cybernetics after I realized that I am a second-order cybernetist. After I learned about the work of, you know, Heinz von Förster and so on, and thought, I wish I knew about his work before, in a way, because it enlightened a lot of the things that I, you know, came to through my work. But yes, you're right. That's a very good observation, and I think that you know, the fact that cybernetics and biology are basically very, very connected disciplines, and that Norbert Wiener, you know, wrote about cybernetic systems in humans and animals, yeah, and machines. It's yeah, very much connected. But for me, in the beginning, well, there was just a cybernetic system on right there, you know, the first schematic of the macro lab. Yeah. At the very beginning, it was more referentiality. So when I, for example, I knew about the work of some artists that were working with machines, yeah, not only machines, but also computers as machines. And that was the reference. Yeah? I tried to understand that part of the work. Yeah? People like Marko Peljhan and Survival Research Labs, or 𝗟𝗏𝗏, whom I met quite early on, or Ponomarenko, and people in theater that worked in kind of this cybernetic way almost. Or, you know, in music, of course, you know, with the revolution of electronic music and, you know, the appearance of sequencers and the Atari ST machine and Cubase software for sequencing. That was, for me, really the understanding that I understood then that these machines are really going to change everything we do in the creative sense, and that this is the start of a new era. And that's, you know, it's also connected to the fact that we had this electronic music, small group of people here in Ljubljana at that time, 91, 92, around the studio of Grega Zemljić, Miha Klemenčić, in the cellar of the grandmother of Uroš. And this was very, very important at the time for us to understand this. And yes, it was a referentiality to the things that we knew about that happened in the 60s. 9 evenings, theater and engineering events, and then of course also the work in Zagreb, Vladimir Bonačić, and the new tendencies, which we knew very little about then, literally just a few articles here and there, and the misunderstanding that computer art is all just, drawings made by computers and stuff like that. Whereas I was always interested in the machine itself, yeah. And so yes, yeah, a lot of referentiality, but I learned, I started studying cybernetics and teaching it. Now it's a big part of my curriculum at the moment in the United States. Only 23, 24 years ago.
Thank you. Any questions maybe from the public, or you're also very tired from the weather outside? Yeah, sure.
Yes. Oh, okay, great. Yeah, thanks so much. Super interesting. I was just wondering, do you find how have you found the attitudes towards, working with big, exploration companies has shifted over the last 30 years? And also in relation as maybe your work's become better known, the willingness to send prototypes and this kind of exchange.
Can you repeat? Exploration companies?
Sorry, I mean, in terms of the, companies that you were collaborating with, whether they knew it or not earlier on, how have you felt that I guess their attitude towards working with artists has changed or not over the last 30 years?
Well, it's not monolithic, right? I mean, you have very different situations. I think, in general, the so-called military-industrial complex is not interested in artists whatsoever. Yeah, it's a very engineering-oriented world, and it's very difficult to engage most of those people. I would say most of the time, not always, but most of the time. On the other, so that attitude has never changed really. Before it was maybe more naive, yeah, but then people became really, more astute in identifying, people that wanted maybe something more out of them than they were prepared to give. On the other hand, you have large corporations nowadays, such as, Elon Musk, SpaceX, and so on, which, with the rebirth, for example, at LACMA, there is a rebirth for the art and technology program, and they're sponsoring that, or even, the large Silicon Valley corporations like Google and Facebook, maybe not so much, but Google for sure, with its artificial intelligence work and AI labs and so on. There is a dialogue there. I don't necessarily think that dialogue has anything to do with reflection whatsoever. Yeah, I think it's very transactional, quite surface. So I don't know. I mean, I don't think that anything has changed so much. Maybe corporations, of course, you cannot. They're not monolithic. There's so many different types. Usually some smaller corporations are much more open because behind a lot of research there is, very curious people that are curious by nature, and they will engage also with the arts and so on in many ways. But it's, I don't think it has changed much, to tell you the truth. Yeah, if that was your question, I think it's evolving, but the fascinating for me, you know, when we talk about the relationship of corporations and the arts and art and technology specifically, there's such a case study in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Art and Technology program, yeah? That was run from 66 to 72, and then resulted in EAT building the Osaka Pavilion, and which was kind of a culmination of that era, I would say, and of collaboration. But when you really study this, yeah, when you go down to it, like with everything, really, you know, this is where, you know, we can kind of deduct all kinds of laws and talk about some generalizations and so on. It comes down to some individuals, yeah. In the case of, you know, the LAC Art and Technology was the curator, was Maurice Tuckman. Nowadays, almost nobody knows about him, yeah. But it was just his energy, his idea. It was very naive too. It was like, okay, we're in Southern California, and this is the aerospace and technology hub of the world, which then it was. There was no Silicon Valley per se, yeah. And Silicon Valley was beautiful, you know, fields and growing tomatoes and strawberries. And but Southern California, Los Angeles basin and so on, that was, you know, the center of aerospace in the world and high technology and so on. And that's where, you know, he said, okay, well, we'll talk to different corporations, but not only there, but it came from that impetus that, you know, they could work with this really incredible arts that started happening, the modernists of the time. And if you look at who participated and so on, and who, you know, Robert Irwin, James Turrell, I mean, it's like a list of these people that really then changed the, you know, some perspectives in the art world. And so I think that's a really amazing case study, yeah, for everybody. It's, yes, America-centric because it happened there. There are embryonic moments like that also elsewhere, like New Tendencies in Zagreb there were similar connections to some corporations like Rade Končar and so on. I don't know how much ISKRA had to do here with it, but you know, in Yugoslavia everybody was talking to each other and so on. So there might have been some of that. So, you know, if you look at that and you study that, you see that not a lot changed from there. And it's always down, as I said before, to individuals. The experiments in art and technology started, you know, because Billy Kluver, the engineer from Bell Labs, it was not Bell Labs, you know, it was not the corporate office of Bell Labs saying, okay, guys, you know, there's this interesting art going on in the world. You know, Billy, you go talk to these artists, you know, let's do something with them. This didn't happen. It was one guy who had a wife who was an artist and was living in New York, yeah. Bell Labs is in New Jersey, but he was living in New York. And he was a personal friend of Robert Rauschenberg. And, you know, that's how it all came into motion. And, you know, from that was born the art and technology avant-garde, yeah, of that time. So, in a way, yes, you know, we can, of course, then identify larger forces and movements and so on. But on the other hand, it's down to individual, you know, connections, courage, sometimes even, you know, courage to do things that some, you know, seem to be completely out of bounds. And that's how this movement in that specific area happened. Because I think there's a lot of co-option potential. I see that now really with machine learning and all of that and the arts, and there's a lot, you know, not a lot of projects that are reflecting the field. Yeah, there's a lot of just repeating what the technology is providing. Yeah.
Thanks.
A long answer.
Anybody else? Yeah, there. You'll get the mic.
Hi, I would have a question which is concerning essentially this like interface of art and like sort of commercial applications, which I find like really interesting. Since you have sort of like experience with this and did also projects which sort of like traveled from one field in the other field, do you see this as a personal sort of like extension of your artistic practice when something like this happens? Or is it more, is there some sort of like border at what point you say, okay, this is now something which is more an applied, kind of like embedded in like a commercial field thing, or is this like a floating process in a sense?
Yeah, I think it would be very pretentious to, you know, dragoon everybody that is not aware of the artistic beginnings of all of these stories and just call them part of my art project, yeah. No, so the answer is no, but there's also no hard border, it's true, yeah. And it's a process, you know, for lack of a better word. Because it's a dialogue, yeah, and it's education too. So in the specific case, you know, the company that we founded, which builds unmanned systems and so on, it's you know, I find sometimes you know, when the engineers would come to me and say, "Mark," and they ask me, because I try to keep back a little bit, but they ask me, "Can you talk to us about? Oh, we just read." I was looking on the internet and found an interview with you. Wow, I didn't know you were doing this and that and that. Yeah, so you know, it's a process. Maybe one day, you know, it's also egos and all kinds of stuff going on. Yeah, because I'm not alone in these projects, so it's a very delicate territory on that level. But for me, of course, it's you know, I used to describe my work, I use the word maybe a few times in the interviews and so on, and it's, you know, it's pretty tautological, you know, progressive activity in time. And that's how I see all of this, yeah. I think once you enter into certain spaces, it's a matter of navigation, orientation, and dialogue, because I don't exclude almost anybody, yeah. I think dialogue is a crucial element of human intelligence, and it's very, very important to have those communication lines open, because you always can learn something, and maybe, you know, that's how evolution happens.
Some other questions? Okay. Thank you, Marko, so much for this conversation. Thank you all for staying pretty long. We still have 2 hours to get dinner before they close down the streets again because of COVID. Thank you all for attending today's program, and hopefully see you tomorrow at 11 in the skyscraper building, the Tier 3 in the Republic Square, where a nascent studio, Max Hampshire and Paul Zeidler, will present their work, Temporal Secessionism, and it will be followed by the last tour around the Biennale, which will be given by me and curatorial assistant 𝗟𝗻𝗄. So you're very welcome to attend tomorrow at 11. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.